October the 13th, 1899. Colonel Robert Baden-Powell stood on the corrugated iron roof of Dixon's Hotel in the small South African railway town of Mafeking, watching through his field glasses as 9,000 Boer commandos surrounded his garrison of 1,250 soldiers and police. Behind him, 7,500 African civilians huddled in their segregated township, hoping the British would protect them. Before him stretched the Transvaal border, just 7 miles away, where more Boer forces gathered. He had provisions for perhaps 4 months if rationed carefully. The nearest British relief column was 200 miles south, with 40,000 Boer fighters between them. The choice before Baden-Powell was binary and brutal. Surrender the town immediately and spare everyone the horrors of siege warfare, or dig in and attempt something that military experts considered tactically insane. Holding an indefensible border town against a besieging force 7 times his size, with no hope of relief for months, possibly never. If he surrendered, Britain would lose a strategic railway junction connecting Cape Colony to Rhodesia, and the Boers would gain a bloodless propaganda victory that might bring wavering British colonies to question the Empire's resolve. If he fought and failed, thousands of civilians would die slowly of starvation or disease. His men would be butchered in a final assault, and he would be remembered as the fool who threw away lives defending the indefensible. This was the most lopsided siege ratio in modern warfare. By comparison, the legendary siege of Ladysmith involved 13,000 defenders against 21,000 attackers, far more balanced odds. Military doctrine of the era held that a defending force needed at least 1 soldier for every 3 attackers to hold fortifications successfully. Baden-Powell had 1 defender for every 7 attackers. The mathematics of annihilation seemed certain. What happened over the next 217 days would become the most celebrated siege in British imperial history, make Baden-Powell the most famous soldier in the empire, and inspire wild celebrations across Britain when relief finally came. The siege of Mafeking would coin phrases still used today, revolutionize military thinking about guerrilla defense, and demonstrate that audacity, deception, and ruthless resource management could overcome impossible odds. Yet somehow, despite inspiring the founding of the worldwide scouting movement and dominating headlines for 7 months, the tactical brilliance of Mafeking has faded from popular consciousness, overshadowed by larger battles and more troubling questions about imperial warfare. By the end of this story, you'll understand why this matters more than its obscurity suggests, because Mafeking represents something profound about human resilience, the terrifying choices leaders face in desperate circumstances, and the uncomfortable truths about how modern siege warfare actually works when stripped of romantic mythology. You'll see how one eccentric, English officer with a genius for theatricality turned a death trap into a masterclass of defensive warfare, and why military academies studied his tactics for decades afterward, even as the moral complexities of the siege grew more troubling with time. This is the story of the impossible siege, somehow forgotten by everyone except military historians and scouting enthusiasts, yet representing one of the most audacious defensive stands in modern warfare. But we can't just jump straight to the siege without understanding the context, because without grasping why Britain and the Boer republics collided in 1899, the tactical brilliance of Mafeking appears as mere colonial skirmishing rather than what it actually was. A strategic linchpin in a war that would reshape Africa and foreshadow the brutal total wars of the 20th century. The discovery that transformed everything happened in 1886, when Australian prospector George Harrison stumbled across gold-bearing rock on a Witwatersrand farm in the Transvaal Republic. Within 5 years, the Transvaal, a landlocked, agrarian Boer republic with perhaps 120,000 white citizens, suddenly controlled the world's richest gold deposits. By 1895, the Witwatersrand was producing over 1/4 of the world's gold supply. This created an almost unbearable geopolitical tension. The Transvaal Republic and its sister state, the Orange Free State, both founded by Dutch-descended Boers, Afrikaners, after the great trek away from British rule in the 1830s, now possessed mineral wealth that dwarfed many European treasuries. Yet these republics remained politically independent, governed by conservative Calvinist farmers who viewed British imperialism with justified suspicion and deep resentment. Think about what this meant for Britain in the 1890s. The British Empire controlled approximately 1/4 of the world's land surface and population, but its industrial supremacy faced mounting challenges from Germany and the United States. The gold standard underpinned international trade, and British financial power rested substantially on controlling gold supplies. Yet here sat two tiny republics, the Transvaal and Orange Free State, with a combined white population of perhaps 250,000, controlling gold that could shift the global balance of power. The British government, led by Colonial Secretary Joseph Chamberlain, calculated that if the Transvaal remained independent and possibly aligned with Germany, which was actively courting Transvaal President Paul Kruger, Britain's dominance in southern Africa would collapse. Already, the Transvaal was purchasing modern German artillery, Krupp guns and howitzers that could threaten British supremacy. The Cape Colony British population was outnumbered by both Afrikaners and African populations. Rhodesia to the north remained a fragile chartered company territory. Moreover, British citizens, called Uitlanders, foreigners, by the Boers, flooded into the Transvaal, gold fields, eventually outnumbering the Boer population in the mining districts. These Uitlanders were denied voting rights by President Kruger, who correctly feared they would vote to join the British Empire if enfranchised. This created a perfect justification for British intervention, protecting the democratic rights of British subjects abroad. The situation escalated dramatically after the Jameson Raid of 1895-96, when British-backed raiders attempted to overthrow the Transvaal government. The raid failed spectacularly, but it convinced President Kruger that war with Britain was inevitable. He began militarizing aggressively, purchasing 37,000 Mauser rifles, 20 million rounds of ammunition, and dozens of modern artillery pieces from Germany, France, and Sweden. By 1899, the Transvaal and Orange Free State could field approximately 40,000 mounted commandos, citizen soldiers who brought their own horses and rifles, men who had learned marksmanship hunting on the veldt and who could shoot accurately at ranges that shocked British regulars accustomed to closer-range colonial warfare. The Boer military system was unique and formidable. Unlike European conscript armies, Boer commandos elected their own officers, fought in loose formations using modern rifles, and excelled at mobile warfare. Every adult male Boer could ride and shoot. They knew the terrain intimately. Their preferred tactic was the 3-day battle. Engage British forces, inflict maximum casualties from long range using superior marksmanship, then vanish into the veldt before the British could bring artillery to bear. Britain, conversely, entered 1899 with approximately 27,000 regular troops in southern Africa. Mostly infantry trained for formal European warfare, not mobile operations against mounted sharpshooters in vast, arid terrain. The British assumed that the war, if it came, would be brief. How could farmers defeat the empire upon which the sun never set? And that's exactly what terrified everyone who understood military realities. The Boers possessed interior lines, modern weapons, mobility advantages, and the prospect of defensive warfare on familiar ground. The British would need to ship troops 6,000 miles around the Cape of Good Hope, then move them across a hostile territory without adequate railways, facing an enemy who could strike anywhere and disappear. The logistics alone seemed overwhelming. By September 1899, President Kruger had issued an ultimatum. Britain must withdraw its forces from the Transvaal borders within 48 hours or face war. Britain rejected the ultimatum. On October 11, 1899, the Second Boer War began with coordinated Boer invasions of British territory at multiple points along a 500-mile frontier. The Boers struck first, hard, and with strategic sophistication that shocked British commanders. Their plan was ambitious: invade Cape Colony and Natal before British reinforcements could arrive, capture the railway towns that formed the logistical backbone of British power, and trigger a general Afrikaner uprising across British territories. If successful, this strategy would give the Boers negotiating leverage to force British recognition of independence. The key to this strategy was speed. Capture the frontier towns before Britain could concentrate its forces. 3 targets were paramount: Kimberley, the diamond mining center; Ladysmith, the main British military base in Natal; and Mafeking, the railway junction connecting Cape Colony to Rhodesia and controlling the western invasion route. Mafeking sat on the border between Cape Colony and the Transvaal, 7 miles south of Transvaal territory. It was not a natural fortress. The town was built on flat terrain with no commanding heights, surrounded by open veldt offering attackers excellent fields of fire and approaches from any direction. The fortifications, when Baden-Powell arrived, consisted of nothing: no walls, no trenches, no prepared defensive positions. The town's significance was purely strategic. It controlled the railway running north to Bulawayo in Rhodesia and served as a concentration point for the British South Africa Police. When Boer commandos surrounded Mafeking on October the 13th, just 2 days after the war began, they expected quick surrender. The town appeared indefensible. The British garrison was tiny. The Boer commander, General Piet Cronje, led 9,000 veteran fighters armed with modern Mausers and backed by a dozen artillery pieces, including a massive 94-pound Creusot long-tom siege gun that could hurl shells 6 miles. Against this force stood Baden-Powell's 1,250 defenders, 700 men from the Protectorate Regiment, mostly recruited from Rhodesia, 300 from the Bechuanaland Rifles, and 250 from the Cape Police. Additionally, approximately 7,500 African civilians lived in the native township, the Stadt, which the British had not evacuated despite knowing the siege was coming. What nobody yet understood, not the Boers, not British High Command in Cape Town, not even most of Baden-Powell's own officers, was that the eccentric 42-year-old colonel standing on Dixon's hotel roof possessed a unique combination of theatrical flair, guerrilla instinct, and absolute ruthlessness that would transform this death trap into the British Empire's most celebrated defensive stand. There was one man who thought differently about Mafeking, and his name would become synonymous with resourcefulness and pluck throughout the English-speaking world. Robert Stevenson Smith Baden-Powell, the hyphenated name itself suggested aristocratic privilege, was born in London on February the 22nd, 1857, the 8th of 10 children. His father, Reverend Baden-Powell, without the hyphen, was a distinguished Oxford mathematics professor who died when Robert was just 3 years old. His mother, Henrietta Grace, née Smith, was a remarkable woman who raised her large family on limited means, instilling in them values of self-reliance, outdoor adventure, and cheerful perseverance through hardship. Young Baden-Powell, known as Steve to his family, grew up exploring the woods and waters around London with his brothers, learning tracking, camping, and survival skills that were unusual for Victorian boys of his class. He attended Charterhouse School, where he distinguished himself not through academic excellence, but through his enthusiasm for amateur theatrics, sketching, and outdoor adventures. He was an indifferent student academically, but showed remarkable talent for observation and mimicry. In 1876, at age 19, Baden-Powell took the British Army entrance examination and placed second for cavalry, earning a direct commission to the 13th Hussars in India without attending Sandhurst, an unusual achievement that saved his family the expense of military academy fees. This would prove significant. Baden-Powell entered military service without formal military education, free from conventional doctrine about how warfare should be conducted. His early military career in India and Afghanistan during the late 1870s and early 1880s exposed him to frontier warfare's realities: small unit actions, reconnaissance, the importance of local intelligence, and guerrilla tactics. Unlike officers who viewed colonial service as merely a posting before returning to European-style warfare, Baden-Powell became fascinated with how indigenous forces fought. He studied tracking techniques, learned multiple languages, and developed expertise in reconnaissance and intelligence gathering. The turning point came in the early 1880s when Baden-Powell was transferred to South Africa, serving in campaigns against the Zulus and other African peoples. Here he encountered the veldt, the vast flat grasslands that offered no natural cover and where visibility could extend for miles. He learned that conventional European infantry tactics were suicide in such terrain against mobile, dispersed forces. He observed how the Boers fought, using terrain, marksmanship, and mobility instead of massed formations. By the mid-1880s, Baden-Powell had developed an unconventional military philosophy. He believed in decentralized command, initiative at junior levels, camouflage and concealment, deception and psychological warfare, and turning enemies' strengths into weaknesses. These ideas were heretical to Victorian military thinking, which prized discipline, formations, and bayonet charges. His unconventional approach brought both fame and controversy. In 1887, while serving as intelligence officer in South Africa, Baden-Powell successfully infiltrated Boer-held territory by disguising himself as a journalist and sketching Boer fortifications while pretending to be a butterfly collector, encoding military information into his butterfly drawings. This exploit earned him a reputation as a clever spy, but also as something of a showman whose theatricality some senior officers found unseemly. Baden-Powell's career took him across the empire, Malta, West Africa, India again, and back to Africa. Everywhere he went, he studied indigenous warfare techniques and wrote training manuals that emphasized practical fieldcraft over parade ground drill. His 1899 manual, Aids to Scouting for NCOs and Men, became unexpectedly popular, not just in military circles, but among civilian youth groups who were inspired by its emphasis on outdoor skills and self-reliance. By 1899, Baden-Powell held the rank of colonel and commanded the British forces in northwest Cape Colony. He was well known within military circles, but far from famous to the British public. He was 42 years old enough to have extensive experience, young enough for physical hardship. He had never commanded forces in a major battle. His reputation rested on reconnaissance work, small unit actions, and training innovations, useful skills perhaps, but not the resume of a great military commander. Yet, Baden-Powell possessed something that would prove more valuable than formal military education. He understood siege warfare's psychology. He knew that defending a position was as much about maintaining morale, controlling information, and manipulating the enemy's perceptions as about military force. He had studied the siege of Ladysmith during the First Boer War and concluded that passive defense was fatal. Defenders must harass, deceive, and unnerve besiegers constantly to maintain fighting spirit and prevent the terrible psychological collapse that dooms besieged forces. He also understood something darker and more controversial. In siege warfare, every mouth to feed weakens defensive capability. Civilians are liabilities. Rations must be controlled ruthlessly. Sentiment is a luxury that can doom everyone. This understanding would lead to decisions during the Mafeking siege that remain morally contentious more than a century later. Baden-Powell's personal life revealed both charm and troubling blind spots. He was sociable, theatrical, and possessed a gift for inspiring loyalty among his officers and men. He sketched constantly, a habit that allowed him to record defensive positions, enemy movements, and propaganda imagery. He performed in amateur theatricals, believing that entertainment maintained morale. He was a lifelong bachelor at this point. He would marry only after the war, at age 55, devoted to his military career and his mother. But he also possessed the casual racism typical of Victorian imperialism, viewing Africans as inherently inferior and useful primarily as labor. This attitude would profoundly shape the siege's conduct, particularly regarding the African civilian population trapped inside Mafeking. Baden-Powell saw the African stat as a logistical problem, thousands of mouths consuming rations that should go to white defenders. His solution would involve some of the siege's most morally troubling decisions. By October 1899, Baden-Powell had concluded that Mafeking must be held at all costs. He understood that if the Boers captured all three strategic railway towns, Kimberley, Ladysmith, and Mafeking, within the war's first month, they would control the interior lines and the psychological momentum. Relief columns would need to advance across hundreds of miles of hostile territory, giving the Boers time to trigger the hoped-for Afrikaner uprising in Cape Colony. The strategic situation would become potentially unwinnable for Britain. Moreover, Baden-Powell recognized that Mafeking offered something the other besieged towns did not: an opportunity for active defense. Kimberley was a mining town filled with civilians, mostly concerned with protecting diamond operations. Ladysmith contained the bulk of British military forces in Natal and was a legitimate military target. But Mafeking was small enough, remote enough, and close enough to the border to allow guerrilla raids, deception operations, and psychological warfare on a scale impossible in larger towns. Baden-Powell had one additional advantage. He arrived in Mafeking months before the siege began. In the spring and summer of 1899, as war clouds gathered, Baden-Powell concentrated forces in Mafeking and began preparing defenses. While British High Command in Cape Town hoped diplomacy would prevent war, Baden-Powell was digging trenches, stockpiling supplies, and planning guerrilla operations. His preparations revealed his philosophy. Rather than building imposing fortifications that would signal defensive intent, Baden-Powell created camouflaged positions, dug trenches that were invisible from more than 100 yards away, and established fake fortifications in obvious places. He constructed a ring of forts around the town's perimeter, actually just sandbag positions with corrugated iron roofs, but from a distance they looked like substantial strongpoints. He planted dummy landmines in front of positions, actually just wooden boxes with protruding wires, creating minefields that existed only in Boer imagination. He strung barbed wire in elaborate patterns, but left gaps that could be covered by rifle fire, deliberately creating killing zones that appeared to be weaknesses. Most importantly, Baden-Powell stockpiled food, ammunition, and medical supplies. He commandeered civilian stocks, organized rationing systems before the siege began, and shipped non-essential civilians out by rail while routes remained open. When criticized for these measures before war officially started, Baden-Powell replied that if war came, these preparations would mean survival. If war didn't come, supplies could be returned. He was betting his career on war being inevitable. He also began recruiting the African population, though in carefully segregated and subordinate roles. He established the Black Watch, African guards responsible for preventing cattle theft and maintaining order in the Stadt. He recruited African runners to carry messages through Boer lines, a task too dangerous for white soldiers in Baden-Powell's calculation. He employed African laborers for fortification work. However, he explicitly refused to arm the African population for combat, fearing both Boer reprisal and the precedent of arming black Africans against white Boers in what the British officially characterized as a white man's war. By early October 1899, when Boer commandos appeared on the horizon, Baden-Powell had transformed Mafeking from an indefensible railway town into an elaborate defensive network that existed as much in perception as in reality. The visible defenses looked formidable. The invisible preparations, stockpiled supplies, organized rationing, planned guerrilla operations, would determine whether those defenses could hold. On October 11th, when war officially began, Baden-Powell sent a telegram to British High Command in Cape Town. Mafeking will hold until relief arrives. Request relief column advance as soon as practicable. The phrase, as soon as practicable, was carefully chosen. Baden-Powell knew relief could take months, possibly 6 months or more, given the strategic situation. He was telling his superiors, we can hold indefinitely if properly supported. 2 days later, On October the 13th, as Baden-Powell watched through his field glasses as General Cronje's commandos completed their encirclement, he faced the decision that would define his life and legacy. Surrender or defend the indefensible. He chose to fight. Most commanders thought defending Mafeking was impossible, and they had rational reasons supporting that assessment. The obstacles Baden-Powell faced weren't merely difficult. They stacked into a ladder of impossibility that seemed to make defeat inevitable. First, the mathematics of siege warfare were brutal. Military doctrine held that successful defense required roughly one-third the attacking force's strength when fighting from prepared fortifications. Baden-Powell had roughly one-seventh the Boer's strength. Worse, the fortifications were essentially trenches and sandbag positions, nothing resembling the stone walls, deep ditches, and interlocking defensive works of European fortresses. A determined Boer assault could likely overwhelm any section of the perimeter within hours if pressed with sufficient force. Second, the terrain favored attackers. Mafeking sat on flat veldt with no natural defensive advantages, no rivers protected flanks, no hills provided commanding positions. The Boers could bring artillery to within 3,000 yards of the town's center from any direction, shelling defenders and civilians alike. The town's perimeter stretched nearly 8 miles, far too long for 1,250 men to defend adequately. Conventional military wisdom suggested that Baden-Powell should have concentrated his forces in a small, heavily fortified position, but that would abandon most of the town to Boer occupation and eliminate any possibility of active defense. Third, the water supply was vulnerable. Mafeking depended on wells, scattered throughout the town. If the Boers advanced close enough to deny access to these wells, the garrison would face death by thirst within days. Baden-Powell had attempted to dig a deep well in the town center, but the water struck at 60 feet was brackish and insufficient for 9,000 people and thousands of livestock. Fourth, the food situation was precarious. Baden-Powell had stockpiled supplies during the summer, but feeding 9,000 people, 1,250 soldiers and police, roughly 700 white civilians who remained after evacuation orders, and 7,500 Africans in the Stadt, for an unknown duration required brutal rationing. The initial supplies, even with rationing, could last perhaps 4 months. After that, starvation would begin systematically weakening defenders until they became incapable of manning positions. Fifth, medical capabilities were primitive. The town had 2 doctors and a small hospital with perhaps 30 beds. Siege warfare inevitably generated casualties from artillery, snipers, and disease. Without modern antibiotics, even minor wounds frequently turned septic. Typhoid, dysentery, and other diseases spread rapidly in besieged towns where sanitation deteriorated. Baden-Powell could expect to lose more men to disease than enemy action, standard for 19th century warfare, and had no way to replace casualties. Sixth, the garrison lacked heavy artillery. Baden-Powell's armament consisted of rifles, machine guns, and 7 antiquated artillery pieces, 4 7-pounder muzzle-loading guns, 2 303 Maxim guns, and 1 ancient 16-pounder that belonged in a museum. Against this, the Boers brought modern Krupp guns, French Creusot artillery, and, most terrifyingly, a 94-pound siege gun capable of demolishing buildings from beyond the range of British return fire. The artillery imbalance meant the Boers could shell Mafeking with impunity, while Baden-Powell's gunners were reduced to firing desperate counter-battery shots that rarely connected. Seventh, relief was impossibly distant. The nearest British forces concentrated at Cape Town and other southern positions, more than 200 miles away across hostile territory. The railway to Mafeking ran through Boer-controlled land, unusable for relief. Any relief column would need to march across veldt, fighting past multiple Boer positions, while maintaining supply lines that stretched for hundreds of miles. Military planners estimated that organizing a relief force, marching north, and breaking through to Mafeking would require at least 4 months, probably 6. Baden-Powell was being asked to hold for half a year or more. Eighth, the political situation was dire. Britain was fighting simultaneously at 3 besieged locations: Mafeking, Kimberley, and Ladysmith, plus fighting mobile battles across a 500-mile front. British commanders faced agonizing choices about where to concentrate forces. Ladysmith held the largest garrison and most strategic importance. Kimberley contained Cecil Rhodes, the enormously wealthy and politically connected mining magnate, whose telegrams demanded priority relief. Mafeking, by comparison, was strategically important but held fewer troops and lacked powerful advocates. Baden-Powell had no guarantee that relief would come at all. If British forces were defeated in major battles, Mafeking might be written off as a necessary sacrifice. Ninth, the international dimension was threatening. Germany, France, and other European powers watched the war carefully, and some hoped for British defeat. If the Boers won quick victories, European intervention or mediation might force Britain to accept Boer independence. Baden-Powell's siege needed to hold long enough for Britain to mobilize overwhelming force and crush Boer field armies, potentially a year or more. The longer the siege continued, the greater the chance that international pressure would complicate relief efforts. Tenth, the morale challenge was perhaps most dangerous. Defending forces trapped in siege warfare historically suffered catastrophic psychological collapse. Men watched friends die from artillery fire, against which they were helpless. Civilians panicked and demanded surrender. Food shortages led to internal conflict. Rumors of imminent assault created panic. Discipline deteriorated. After several months, besieged forces often simply surrendered even when militarily capable of continuing because the psychological burden became unbearable. Against these obstacles, Baden-Powell possessed only his preparations, his men's morale, and his genius for deception and psychological warfare. He was risking his reputation, his career, everything on the gamble that audacity could overcome arithmetic. His plan, revealed in orders issued on October the 13th as the siege closed, broke every conventional rule about defensive warfare. Instead of concentrating forces in a small, heavily fortified position, Baden-Powell stretched his garrison thin around the entire perimeter, manning forward positions that appeared impossible to hold. Instead of conserving ammunition through defensive fire only, Baden-Powell ordered constant harassing fire, snipers, machine guns, and artillery firing at Boer positions day and night to prevent them from feeling secure. Instead of waiting passively for relief, Baden-Powell planned guerrilla raids against Boer positions, attacking their supply wagons, sniping at their camps, and generally making the besiegers' lives miserable. Most radically, Baden-Powell planned to turn the siege into a propaganda campaign. He established a daily newspaper, the Mafeking Mail, published throughout the siege, filled with optimistic bulletins, humorous articles, and fabricated victories designed to maintain morale. He organized concerts, sporting events, and theatrical performances. He issued stamps depicting successful defense. He sent African runners through Boer lines carrying messages to Cape Town, messages carefully written to generate sympathetic newspaper coverage in Britain. He was gambling that the Boers would settle into conventional siege operations, surrounding the town, shelling positions, and waiting for starvation to force surrender, rather than launching the immediate, overwhelming assault that would certainly capture Mafeking, but would cost the Boers significant casualties. Baden-Powell was betting that General Cronje valued Boer lives too highly to spend them on a town that would eventually fall anyway to starvation. This was an enormous gamble because it meant enduring months of hardship and death while waiting for relief that might never come. It meant watching civilians suffer. It meant making brutal decisions about rationing and resource allocation. It meant accepting that some people would die, were going to die, so that the majority might survive until relief arrived. On the evening of October 13th, as the Boer ring closed, Baden-Powell assembled his officers in Dixon's hotel and outlined his strategy. One officer, Captain Fitzclarence, asked the obvious question. "Colonel, how long can we actually hold?" Baden-Powell's response revealed his thinking. "Gentlemen, we can hold as long as the Boers believe we can hold. Our greatest weapon is their caution. Our task is to make them believe Mafeking is too strong to storm and too dangerous to assault. Every day we hold is a propaganda victory. Every week we hold demoralizes their forces and inspires relief columns. If we can hold for 4 months, we save the strategic situation. If we hold for 6 months, we become legends." He paused, then added the darker truth. "And to hold that long, we must be absolutely ruthless about resources. Nothing is wasted. Nobody gets special treatment. When the time comes, hard choices will be necessary. But if we do this correctly, gentlemen, Mafeking will be remembered long after all of us are forgotten." The officers filed out to their positions. The siege had begun. The approach to the climax, the first 100 days of siege, demonstrated Baden-Powell's genius for guerrilla defense, while revealing the terrible arithmetic of starvation warfare. On October the 14th, the first full day of siege, General Cronje sent a delegation under white flag requesting Baden-Powell's surrender. The Boer message was straightforward. Resistance was hopeless. The garrison would be treated honorably as prisoners of war. Civilians would be released unharmed. Baden-Powell's response was theatrical. He invited the Boer envoys to tour the defenses, showing them, carefully selected, strong positions bristling with weapons, demonstrating faked minefields, and gesturing toward imaginary reinforcements allegedly en route. He then declined surrender, expressing confidence in relief arriving within weeks. The envoys reported back to Cronje that Mafeking appeared strongly fortified. This was the first victory. The Boers decided that immediate assault would be too costly, settling instead for artillery, bombardment, and waiting for starvation. On October 16th, the Boer bombardment began. The 94-pound Long Tom opened fire, its shells screaming across the veldt to explode in Mafeking with terrifying crashes. For defenders and civilians accustomed only to rifle fire, the psychological impact was overwhelming. Buildings collapsed, fragments scythed through streets, the population panicked, fleeing to shelters or lying flat in trenches. Baden-Powell responded with characteristic showmanship. He established a lookout system where spotters watched for the Long Tom's muzzle flash, then rang warning bells giving citizens approximately 15 seconds to take cover before the shell arrived. This simple system, turning artillery fire into a predictable event rather than random terror, dramatically reduced casualties and restored morale. Baden-Powell personally stood in the open during bombardments, demonstrating unconcern while sketching the shell impacts to calculate the gun's position. The psychological warfare extended to the Boer artillery crews. Baden-Powell's antiquated 7-pounder guns couldn't match the Boer artillery's range, but his crews fired anyway, lobbing shells that fell short but created the impression of active counter-battery fire. More importantly, Baden-Powell had his armorer create a fake artillery piece, a log mounted on wagon wheels, painted black, and positioned prominently where Boer observers could see it. The gun never fired but occupied considerable Boer attention, with their artillery wasting ammunition trying to destroy it. On October 24th, Baden-Powell launched the first major raid. Captain Fitzclarence led 120 men in a night attack on Boer positions at Game Tree Fort, 1 mile outside Mafeking. The raid's objectives were to capture supplies, destroy artillery positions, and demonstrate that Mafeking was not passively accepting siege. The raid succeeded partially. Fitzclarence's force scattered Boer guards, destroyed several supply wagons, and returned with cattle, but cost 7 casualties, including several wounded. More importantly, the raid's boldness shocked the Boers and energized the garrison. Throughout November, Baden-Powell maintained aggressive patrolling. He sent small units to snipe at Boer positions, cut telegraph wires, and steal cattle. These raids were militarily insignificant but psychologically crucial. They gave garrison troops offensive missions. breaking the psychological passivity that destroys besieged forces. They harassed the besiegers constantly, preventing them from relaxing, and they demonstrated to the outside world, through Baden-Powell's carefully crafted dispatches sent via African runners, that Mafeking was fighting, not merely enduring. The African runners deserve particular attention. Baden-Powell recruited volunteers from the Stadt to carry messages through Boer lines, a journey of roughly 200 miles south to the nearest British positions at Kimberley or Cape Town. These runners faced almost certain capture or death if discovered. Yet volunteers were plentiful, motivated by payment, food rations and money, and by Baden-Powell's promises that their service would be remembered. The runners operated at night, navigating by stars, avoiding roads and Boer patrols. Many were captured and shot. But enough succeeded that Baden-Powell maintained irregular communication with British High Command throughout the siege. These messages served dual purposes. Officially, they reported garrison status and requested relief. Unofficially, they were propaganda masterpieces calculated to generate sympathetic newspaper coverage in Britain. Baden-Powell knew his messages would be shared with journalists, so he crafted them for public consumption, optimistic about holding, respectful of Boer courage, cheerful about hardships, and confident in eventual relief. The messages created the public narrative that would make Mafeking legendary. By December, the first cracks appeared in the defensive facade. Food rationing intensified. The garrison went on half rations, 1 pound of meal per day, supplemented with horse meat and whatever could be scrounged. White civilians received slightly better rations, reflecting Baden-Powell's priorities. African civilians in the Stadt received starvation-level rations, roughly half what white civilians received, justified by Baden-Powell on the grounds that Africans had lower nutritional requirements, a racist pseudoscience popular in Victorian Britain. This decision would haunt Baden-Powell's legacy. The African population began dying of malnutrition by early December. Mortality rates in the Stadt climbed to 3 or 4 per day, mostly children and elderly. Baden-Powell faced an impossible calculation. Stretch rations to feed everyone equally, and the garrison would starve into combat ineffectiveness within 3 months. Or sacrifice the African population's health to preserve fighting capability, accepting that civilians would die while soldiers remained fed. He chose the latter, justifying it as military necessity. Several modern historians view this decision as genocidal, a deliberate choice to starve a racially subordinated population to preserve white lives. Others argue Baden-Powell faced genuinely impossible choices where any decision led to deaths. The truth likely involves both elements. Baden-Powell genuinely believed the siege's outcome depended on maintaining fighting capability, but his racist assumptions determined who would be sacrificed to achieve that goal. The African dead of Mafeking, ultimately several hundred civilians, represent the siege's most morally troubling dimension. On December 26th, Christmas Day had passed in relative quiet, but Boxing Day brought the first major Boer assault. General Cronje, under pressure from Transvaal President Kruger to capture Mafeking, launched a coordinated attack on the eastern defenses. At 3:30 a.m., Boer commandos advanced under cover of darkness toward Game Tree Fort, one of Baden-Powell's outlying positions. The attack failed catastrophically for the Boers. Baden-Powell had anticipated night attacks and established interlocking fields of fire, tripwires connected to warning bells, and carefully concealed machine gun positions. When the Boers advanced, they triggered warnings that alerted defenders seconds before contact. British Maxim guns opened fire, raking the advancing Boers with devastating effect. Rifle fire from the trenches cut down the assault force. Within 30 minutes, the Boers retreated, leaving 28 dead and 40 wounded, their worst single-day casualties of the siege. British losses were 1 killed and 3 wounded. The failed assault validated Baden-Powell's defensive strategy. Cronje concluded that storming Mafeking would cost hundreds of Boer lives, politically unacceptable casualties that would undermine support for the war. He reverted to siege tactics. bombardment and blockade, waiting for starvation. This was exactly what Baden-Powell needed. Time. Yet time brought its own horrors. By January 1900, the food situation became desperate. Horse meat was now the primary protein source. Dogs and cats disappeared from streets. The slaughter of worn-out horses became public events, with crowds waiting to purchase portions. Scurvy appeared among troops due to vitamin deficiencies. The hospital overflowed with dysentery and typhoid cases. In the Stadt, starvation deaths reached 5 or 6 per day. Baden-Powell responded by tightening rationing further. White civilians went to quarter rations. African rations decreased to subsistence levels. Soldiers maintained half rations, prioritized as the only force capable of preventing Boer victory. Food theft became a serious crime, punished by flogging or imprisonment. The garrison's cheerful mood of October and November gave way to grim endurance. On January 8, 1900, nearly 3 months into the siege, relief seemed imminent. Telegrams from Cape Town reported that a relief column under Colonel Herbert Plumer was advancing toward Mafeking from the north, while another force under Lord Methuen approached from the south. Baden-Powell organized a sortie to meet Plumer's column, hoping to link up and escort them into Mafeking. But the relief failed. Plumer's column, just 900 men, was too weak to break through the Boer cordon. Methuen's larger force was stopped at the Battle of Magersfontein, where British infantry advanced in close formation against entrenched Boers and were massacred, one of the war's worst British defeats. Both relief attempts collapsed, and Mafeking remained isolated. This was perhaps the siege's darkest moment. For 3 months, the garrison had endured bombardment, raids, and starvation, sustained by confidence that relief was imminent. Now that hope evaporated. The nearest relief force was defeated and retreating. New plans called for relief in the spring. March or April, another 2 or 3 months away. Could Mafeking hold that long? Baden-Powell assembled his officers and announced, "Gentlemen, relief is delayed, but not cancelled. Our task is to make certain we're still here when relief arrives. The next 100 days will be harder than the first 100. Rations will be cut again. Discipline must be absolute, but we will hold." He then added a darker statement. "Anyone who cannot face what's coming should say so now. No judgment will be made. But if you stay, you commit to seeing this through to the end, whatever that requires." No one left. The time had come for Mafeking's greatest test. The approach to the climax, the middle months of siege from January to April 1900, demonstrated the terrible truth about siege warfare. Most casualties come not from combat, but from slow attrition through starvation, disease, and psychological collapse. By February, Mafeking's food stockpiles were nearly exhausted. The initial 4-month supply was gone. Baden-Powell's officers calculated that remaining supplies, even with the most severe rationing, would last only another month, perhaps 6 weeks. After that, the garrison would be reduced to scavenging whatever could be found, a death spiral that typically preceded surrender in historical sieges. Baden-Powell responded with a controversial innovation. Soup kitchens that mixed available protein sources, horse meat, dubious sausages made from uncertain ingredients, with oat husks, previously considered animal feed. The resulting meal was nutritionally marginal, but provided bulk that reduced hunger pangs. Distribution was carefully controlled. White civilians received 1 bowl per day, soldiers 2 bowls. Africans in the Stadt received access only after white portions were secured. The soup kitchens revealed Baden-Powell's cold resource management. When critics, mainly civilian administrators who remained in town, protested the unequal distribution, Baden-Powell explained his logic with brutal clarity. Every calorie consumed by someone who cannot fight is a calorie wasted. When relief comes, civilians will benefit from our survival. Until then, fighting capacity must be preserved. This utilitarianism, maximizing overall survival by accepting differential suffering, rationalized decisions that in any other context would be recognized as racially discriminatory resource allocation. Meanwhile, the Boer artillery continued daily bombardment. The Long Tom fired 10-20 shells per day, systematically destroying buildings. Lighter artillery targeted defensive positions. Snipers picked off unwary defenders. Casualties accumulated slowly, 2 or 3 per week from enemy action, plus 5 or 6 per week from disease. The hospital overflowed. Grave-digging details worked daily. Baden-Powell maintained morale through relentless propaganda. The Mafeking Mail published daily throughout the siege, each edition filled with optimistic editorials, humor columns, sports results from cricket matches played between bombardments, and fabricated victories in peripheral skirmishes. The newspaper's tone remained resolutely cheerful even as conditions deteriorated, creating an alternative narrative of successful defense that sustained spirits. He also organized entertainment with almost manic frequency. Concerts every week, theatrical performances, even a horse race meeting on Christmas Day before the Boxing Day assault. Critics then and now view this as either genius morale management or callous fiddling while people starved. Likely it was both. Baden-Powell understood that humans need psychological sustenance as much as physical food, but his entertainment budget, in scarce resources, was allocated to military personnel and white civilians, not to the suffering African population. On February 25th, Baden-Powell received the news he dreaded. A telegram from Cape Town informed him that the main relief effort would not begin until late April or May. The strategic situation had shifted dramatically. General Roberts, now commanding British forces in South Africa, was concentrating overwhelming force to crush Boer armies in the field before relieving besieged towns. This strategy prioritized destroying Boer military power over rescuing isolated garrisons. Mafeking would need to hold at least another 2 to 3 months, possibly longer. Baden-Powell called his senior officers together and showed them the calculations. Current rations, already at starvation levels, could support the garrison for perhaps 6 more weeks with extreme rationing. After that, they would be eating whatever could be found, which meant essentially nothing. Mathematical extrapolation suggested the garrison would become combat ineffective by late April, precisely when relief might arrive. The meeting produced Baden-Powell's most controversial decision. He ordered the creation of passes allowing Africans to leave the Stadt and exit through Boer lines. Officially, this was described as allowing non-combatants to escape the siege's horrors and find safety. In reality, it was resource management, removing mouths to feed extended remaining supplies. The Boers, however, refused to allow the African refugees through their lines, sending them back into Mafeking. They correctly understood that feeding refugees helped Baden-Powell more than capturing them helped the Boers. Trapped between British rationing and Boer refusal, the African population in the Stadt faced catastrophic mortality. By March, death rates reached 8-10 per day, primarily from starvation and associated diseases. Sol Plaatje, an African interpreter and journalist who lived in Mafeking during the siege and later wrote an account, described the horrors. People died like flies. Children's bones protruded through their skin. Old people lay in corners waiting for death. The smell of death hung over the Stadt. Plaatje's account, published years later, provided evidence that Baden-Powell knew about the suffering but prioritized military necessity over humanitarian relief. Modern assessment views these events as the siege's darkest chapter. Baden-Powell made no serious effort to equalize rations or share remaining supplies more fairly. His calculations were ruthlessly utilitarian: preserve white lives and fighting capability by accepting African deaths. Estimates suggest 200-300 Africans died from starvation and disease during the siege, deaths that could have been prevented or reduced by more equitable distribution. Yet the strategic situation offered no easy alternatives. If Baden-Powell had distributed rations equally, The garrison would have starved into surrender by March, and the Boers would have captured Mafeking before relief arrived. The town's African population would then have faced Boer occupation, itself no guarantee of better treatment. Baden-Powell's defenders argue he faced genuinely impossible choices. His critics argue his racism determined who would pay the cost of those choices. Meanwhile, the military situation evolved. In late February, British forces under General Roberts won major victories at Paardeberg and elsewhere, capturing General Cronje, who had departed Mafeking to fight in the main theatre, and thousands of Boer troops. These victories transformed the war's strategic picture. The Boers were losing. Relief was no longer a question of if, but when. Baden-Powell received word of these victories via African runners and immediately published optimistic bulletins in the Mafeking Mail, declaring victory imminent. This announcement, though premature, reinvigorated morale. Garrison troops redoubled defensive efforts. Patrols intensified. The bombardment continued, but now it seemed endurable. The end was in sight. On March 15th, Baden-Powell launched his most ambitious raid. Captain Vernon took 150 men on a night attack against Boer positions at Jackal's Tree, where supplies and cattle were reportedly concentrated. The raid succeeded brilliantly, capturing hundreds of cattle and several wagons of supplies. More importantly, it demonstrated that after 5 months of siege, Mafeking remained capable of offensive operations, a powerful signal to both the garrison and the watching world that the defense continued unbroken. Throughout April, the siege settled into its final phase. Food supplies were minimal. Horse meat and oat husks formed the entire menu. Vitamin deficiencies caused widespread scurvy and other deficiency diseases. Morale fluctuated between desperate hope and exhausted resignation. The Boer bombardment continued mechanically, no longer attempting military effect, but simply maintaining pressure. Baden-Powell later wrote that April was the hardest month, not because of military danger, but because everyone was simply worn out. 6 months of siege had exhausted physical and psychological reserves. Soldiers moved mechanically through duties. Civilians huddled in shelters. The African population died quietly in the Stadt. Mafeking had become a ghost town, its survival a matter of sheer stubbornness. Yet they held. Every day that passed was a victory. Every shell that fell on empty buildings was wasted Boer ammunition. Every meal, however meager, was another day closer to relief. By late April, reports reached Mafeking that a major relief column under Colonel Brian Mahon was advancing from the south, supported by a flying column under Colonel Herbert Plumer from the north. This time, the columns were strong enough to fight through the Boer cordon. This time, relief was real. The garrison prepared for the final act. The climax of the Mafeking siege came not as a single dramatic battle, but as a grinding convergence of military pressure, starvation, and the race between relief and collapse. May 1st, 1900. The siege entered its 200th day. Baden-Powell calculated that remaining food supplies could sustain the garrison for perhaps 2 more weeks at current consumption rates. After that, soldiers would become too weak to man positions effectively. The mathematics of starvation were reaching their terminal phase. The Boers, aware that relief columns were approaching, faced their own crisis. If they abandoned the siege, Mafeking would become a propaganda disaster, 6 months wasted besieging a town they failed to capture. If they launched a final assault, casualties would be horrific, but success might salvage something from the debacle. The Boer commander now besieging Mafeking, General Snyman, who replaced Cronje after his February capture, decided on a compromise. Intensify bombardment to catastrophic levels, destroying the town's infrastructure and demoralizing defenders, then demand surrender before relief arrived. On May 3rd, the heaviest bombardment of the siege began. The Long Tom fired continuously throughout the day. Lighter artillery pieces targeted defensive positions with systematic precision. Boer sharpshooters advanced close to the perimeter, firing into British positions. The bombardment continued for 3 days straight, 72 hours of continuous shelling that reduced large sections of Mafeking to rubble. The psychological effect was devastating. After 6 months of steady bombardment, this sudden intensification broke nerves. Civilians panicked, flooding Baden-Powell's headquarters demanding surrender. Soldiers reported increasing desertion threats. One company commander reported that his men were at the breaking point. Another week of this, and they won't be able to fight. Baden-Powell responded by personally visiting every position under fire. He moved openly through streets during bombardment, demonstrating unconcern while debris exploded around him. His theatrical courage was calculated. If the commander showed fear, the garrison would collapse. If he showed confidence, soldiers would hold. This was leadership reduced to its essence. Personal example maintaining collective will. On May 6th, the bombardment ceased. General Snyman sent envoys under a white flag with an ultimatum. Surrender within 24 hours or face a final assault that would show no mercy. The message was clear. Time had run out for both sides. Baden-Powell assembled his officers for what he thought might be the final council of war. The situation was laid out with brutal honesty. Food supplies, 10 days at current rations, perhaps 14 if reduced further, but below that, combat effectiveness would evaporate. Ammunition, adequate for defensive fighting but insufficient for extended battle. Casualties, 13% of the garrison killed or wounded over 6 months, with current strength at approximately 100 effective fighters. Relief columns, reported to be 20-30 miles away but facing Boer resistance and might not break through for another week. The decision was binary. Surrender now and save lives, or fight the final assault, knowing that defeat would mean slaughter and that even victory might leave the garrison too weak to hold against subsequent attacks. Baden-Powell polled his officers. Every man voted to fight. Some voiced practical military reasons. Relief was close. Surrender now would waste 6 months of sacrifice. Others spoke emotionally. They had endured too much to quit now. All agreed on one point. If they fought and lost, that was war. But if they surrendered without fighting when relief was this close, they would never forgive themselves. Baden-Powell sent his response to General Snyman. Mafeking will defend itself to the last man. Relief is imminent. The siege is already lost for you. Withdraw now while you can. The response was pure theater. Baden-Powell had no certainty relief would arrive in time, but it served multiple purposes. It boosted his own garrison's morale. The commander's confidence was unshaken. It might make Snyman hesitate about assault costs, and it would read magnificently in newspapers if carried south by runners. On May 10th, Baden-Powell received word from his scouts that the relief columns were definitely approaching. Colonel Mahn's flying column had fought past Boer resistance at multiple points and was now within 15 miles of Mafeking, advancing quickly. Colonel Plumer's northern force had also broken through and was converging from that direction. Relief was imminent, but whether it would arrive before Snyman launched his assault was unclear. That night, Baden-Powell ordered a desperate gamble. He would launch a preemptive raid against Boer positions, disrupting their assault preparations and signaling to relief columns that Mafeking remained capable of fighting. He selected 200 men, nearly 20% of his effective strength, for the raid, commanded by Captain Vernon and Captain Fitzclarence. At 4:00 a.m. on May 11th, the raiding party crept through darkness toward Boer trenches on the western perimeter. They carried minimal equipment, rifles, grenades, and demolition charges. The plan was to strike fast, destroy artillery positions, and withdraw before the Boers could organize, counterattack. The raid succeeded beyond expectations. Vernon's force surprised Boer positions, killed or captured dozens of defenders, destroyed 2 artillery pieces, and scattered supply wagons. Fitzclarence's group simultaneously attacked from another direction, creating the impression of a coordinated assault by a much larger force. The Boers, Fearing this presaged a breakout attempt supported by the relief columns, pulled back from forward positions to consolidate their lines. The raid's psychological effect was enormous. Garrison morale soared. After 6 months of defense, they had struck back successfully. The Boers, conversely, became cautious and defensive, exactly the mindset Baden-Powell needed. Most importantly, the raid delayed any Boer assault for at least several days while they reorganized. Those several days proved decisive. On May 12th, forward scouts spotted dust clouds to the south, large formations moving rapidly toward Mafeking. This was either the relief column or Boer reinforcements. Baden-Powell ordered the garrison to full alert, manning every position despite their exhaustion. The answer came at 2:00 p.m. when British cavalry appeared on the southern horizon, charging toward Pau, the Boer lines. Colonel Mahn's flying column, 1,100 cavalry and mounted infantry, had broken through. They drove directly at the Boer cordon, scattering defenders and forcing a gap in the siege ring. From Mafeking's walls, garrison troops watched the cavalry advance with disbelieving joy. After 217 days, 7 months and 5 days, relief had arrived. The siege was over. The actual relief involved little fighting. The Boers, faced with strong relief forces from 2 directions and a still defiant garrison, chose to withdraw rather than fight a multi-front battle. General Snyman's commandos pulled back, abandoning their siege positions and retreating northeast. By evening on May the 12th, advanced elements of Mahn's column entered Mafeking, and on May 17th, the main relief force completed the liberation. The scenes in Mafeking were simultaneously joyous and heartbreaking. Garrison soldiers cheered, fired their rifles in celebration, and mobbed the relief column. Baden-Powell, characteristically, organized an immediate review parade. Even exhausted and starving, his troops would make a show of military discipline for the relievers. Civilians wept with relief, embraced soldiers, and began organizing celebrations. But in the Stadt, the African population's mood was more complex. They had survived, but hundreds had died. The relief meant food would arrive, but it also meant their suffering would be forgotten in the celebration of British triumph. Sol Plaatje wrote, "We were glad the siege was over, but we knew our dead would not be remembered as theirs were." The final statistics were grim. The garrison suffered approximately 160 military deaths during the siege, roughly 13% casualties. White civilian deaths numbered perhaps 20-30. African civilian deaths in the Stadt reached at least 200, possibly more than 300. Records were incomplete. Total deaths, approximately 400-500 people over 7 months. The Boers suffered similarly. Approximately 150 Boer commandos were killed during the siege, mostly in failed assaults or raids. Hundreds more were wounded. The siege had immobilized 9,000 Boer fighters who could have been used in the main theater of war, a strategic catastrophe that contributed to eventual Boer defeat. Baden-Powell's first action after relief was to requisition all available food from the relief column and establish feeding stations. Within 48 hours, the starvation emergency ended. Within a week, normal rationing resumed. The siege's physical traces began to fade quickly, but the psychological and moral traces would linger much longer. The immediate aftermath of Mafeking's relief transformed Robert Baden-Powell from a competent but obscure colonel into the most famous soldier in the British Empire, while simultaneously revealing uncomfortable truths about what victory actually meant in siege warfare. When news of Mafeking's relief reached London on May 18, 1900, the reaction was explosive. Crowds flooded into the streets in spontaneous celebration. Newspapers published special editions with triumphant headlines. The term Mafeking, meaning to celebrate riotously, entered the English language that very day. Church bells rang across Britain. The relief of Mafeking became a symbol of British resilience and proof that the empire could not be defeated by Boer farmers. Why such extreme reaction? Partly timing, Mafeking was the last of the three besieged towns to be relieved, and its survival completed a narrative of British persistence overcoming early defeats. Partly propaganda, Baden-Powell's carefully crafted dispatches had created a romantic narrative of plucky defenders holding against impossible odds. Partly psychology, 7 months is long enough for public investment in the outcome, and the siege had become a daily newspaper story that millions followed obsessively. Baden-Powell himself became an instant celebrity. He was promoted to Major General, a 2-rank jump that was nearly unprecedented. He received congratulatory telegrams from the Queen, the Prime Minister, and military commanders worldwide. His photograph appeared in every newspaper. Songs were written about the hero of Mafeking. Commercial products used his image for advertising. He was, for a brief moment, the most famous man in Britain. The reception when Baden-Powell returned to Britain in October 1900 was triumphant. Crowds gathered at train stations to cheer him. He was awarded honors, gave speeches to cheering audiences, and was invited to dine with royalty. The British public desperately needed heroes after the war's early disasters, and Baden-Powell, eccentric, theatrical, demonstrably brave, fit the hero template perfectly. Yet even in 1900, uncomfortable questions emerged. War. Correspondents who visited Mafeking after the relief began reporting the conditions they found. The African stat was described as horrific and worse than a battlefield. The disparity between the relatively well-fed white population and the skeletal African survivors was obvious and disturbing. Questions were raised about why more equitable rationing hadn't been implemented. Baden-Powell's responses to these questions were defensive and revealing. He argued that military necessity demanded preserving fighting capability, that Africans had been offered the chance to leave, ignoring that the Boers refused them passage, and that native populations were more resistant to starvation than Europeans, a racist pseudoscience without medical basis. These justifications satisfied most British audiences in 1900, a testament to contemporary racism, but historians would judge them more harshly. The military analysis began immediately. Tacticians studied Baden-Powell's defensive innovations, the use of fake minefields to channel attacks, the aggressive raiding strategy that kept besiegers off balance, the fake artillery piece that drew enemy fire, the psychological warfare through newspapers and entertainment. These techniques were genuinely innovative and would be studied in military academies for decades. However, military critics also noted that Baden-Powell succeeded partly because the Boers never pressed their advantages. A determined assault in October 1899, when British defenses were minimal, would likely have captured Mafeking at acceptable cost. The Boers' decision to besiege rather than storm was strategic. They wanted to capture territory with minimal casualties, but it gave Baden-Powell time to strengthen defenses and establish the psychological warfare that made assault increasingly difficult. Some critics argued that defending Mafeking at all was strategically questionable. The town had limited military value. The garrison could have withdrawn south before the siege closed, preserving troops for use in the main theater of war. Holding Mafeking immobilized 1,250 British troops for 7 months, troops desperately needed elsewhere. From this perspective, the siege was a propaganda victory, but a strategic waste. Baden-Powell's defenders countered that Mafeking's political and psychological importance outweighed its limited military value. The town's defiant survival boosted British morale during early war disasters. It immobilized 9,000 Boer troops, 7 times the British garrison, and prevented them from fighting in more critical theaters. And it demonstrated that the Boers could not force British surrender even when all tactical advantages favored them. From this perspective, the siege was a strategic success that contributed to eventual British victory. The immediate strategic consequences were clear. The relief of Mafeking coincided with British victories across the theatre. General Roberts captured Pretoria, the Transvaal, capital, on June 5th, 3 weeks after Mafeking's relief. The Boers' conventional military forces collapsed. By September 1900, organized Boer resistance had transitioned to guerrilla warfare, and the war entered a new, uglier phase characterized by British scorched earth tactics and concentration camps. Baden-Powell commanded forces in the subsequent guerrilla war, but never achieved the same fame. His talents were for defensive warfare and psychological operations, not counterinsurgency. After the war ended in 1902, he returned to Britain as a celebrated military hero, but found peacetime army life boring and restrictive. In 1907, Baden-Powell organized an experimental camp on Brownsea Island, where he tested youth training methods based on his military scouting techniques. This experiment evolved into the Boy Scout movement, founded officially in 1908, which would become his lasting legacy. The scouting movement spread worldwide, eventually involving tens of millions of young people. Baden-Powell spent his later years promoting scouting, writing manuals, and traveling to scout gatherings internationally. He married Olave Soames in 1912. He was 55, she was 23, and they had 3 children. He retired from the army in 1910 and was awarded a peerage in 1929, becoming Baron Baden-Powell of Gilwell. He died in Kenya in 1941, age 83, and was buried there. His tombstone features a circle with a dot in the center, the Boy Scout trail sign meaning "I have gone home." The relief of Mafeking also had immediate human consequences. The garrison dispersed, with most troops sent to other fronts. Civilians rebuilt homes and businesses. The African population slowly recovered physically, though the psychological and communal trauma persisted. Sol Plaatje continued his journalism and became a founding member of what would evolve into the African National Congress, advocating for African rights throughout his life. The material evidence of siege rapidly disappeared. Trenches were filled in. Damaged buildings were repaired or demolished. Within 2 years, Mafeking looked much as it had before the siege, with physical scars erased. Only photographs and written accounts preserved the memory of those 217 days. But the strategic and historical consequences would prove far more lasting and complex. But the true significance of Mafeking went beyond immediate celebrations and personal fame. The siege rippled through history at multiple scales, influencing military doctrine, imperial politics, social movements, and cultural memory in ways that remain visible more than a century later. First, at the immediate tactical level, Mafeking revolutionized defensive siege warfare doctrine. Before Mafeking, conventional military wisdom held that besieged forces should concentrate in heavily fortified positions, conserve resources, and wait passively for relief. Baden-Powell demonstrated that active defense, constant raiding, psychological warfare, deception operations, and aggressive patrolling could transform defenders' psychology and disrupt besiegers' plans. Military academies across Europe and America studied Mafeking as a case study in how smaller forces could defeat larger ones through audacity and innovation rather than firepower and fortifications. The fake minefields, dummy artillery, aggressive patrolling, and psychological operations became standard techniques taught to officers. During World War I, British officers defending positions like Kut in Mesopotamia attempted to replicate Baden-Powell's tactics, with less success, largely because they lacked his theatrical gifts and faced more determined besiegers. The principle that morale and deception could multiply limited combat power became foundational to 20th century military thinking. Second, at the strategic theater level, Mafeking's successful defense contributed decisively to British victory in the Second Boer War. By immobilizing 9,000 Boer commandos for 7 months, troops desperately needed in the main theaters, the siege effectively removed a significant Boer force from the strategic chessboard. Those 9,000 men could have reinforced Boer armies fighting against British invasion forces, potentially changing outcomes of critical battles. Instead, they sat outside Mafeking shooting at trenches and watching a town slowly starve. This was a strategic catastrophe for the Boers, and Baden-Powell's success in prolonging the siege maximized that catastrophe. Moreover, Mafeking's defiant survival provided crucial propaganda during Britain's Black Week in December 1899, when British forces suffered multiple disastrous defeats. The news that Mafeking still held, that Baden-Powell still fought, gave the British public and military hope during the war's darkest phase. This psychological effect is difficult to quantify, but was real and important. It maintained British will to continue fighting when negotiations for peace might have tempted a less resolute nation. Third, at the national power dynamics level, the Boer War's outcome reshaped Southern Africa's political landscape for the next century. British victory consolidated imperial control over the region, establishing political structures that would eventually evolve into the Union of South Africa in 1910. This unification created a political entity that, while nominally independent within the British Commonwealth, was dominated by white settlers, both British and Afrikaner, who implemented increasingly racist policies culminating in apartheid. Mafeking's role in this trajectory is indirect but real. British military victory in the Boer War was never certain until the relief of the besieged towns demonstrated that the Boers could not force British surrender even when holding tactical advantages. This realization, that the war would be decided by industrial capacity and numbers rather than tactical brilliance, ultimately led the Boers to accept defeat rather than fight to complete destruction. If Mafeking had fallen, along with Kimberley and Ladysmith, the Boers might have negotiated from strength, potentially preserving greater independence. Fourth, at the continental system level, the Boer War demonstrated to other European powers the limits of informal imperialism and the costs of colonial warfare against modern armed opponents. The sight of the British Empire, the world's dominant power, struggling for 2 years to defeat 40,000 farmers, shocked European observers. Germany, in particular, drew lessons about the vulnerability of extended empires and the importance of strategic railways and fortifications. These lessons influenced German military planning that would culminate in World War I. The siege warfare tactics developed at Mafeking would reappear, refined and elaborated, during World War I's trench warfare. The principle of holding fortified positions through active defense, constant patrolling, raiding, and psychological warfare became foundational to how armies fought during 1914-1918. The direct line from Mafeking's trenches to the Western Front's trenches is not linear, but the conceptual connections are clear. Fifth, at the century-long ripple effects level, Mafeking's most lasting impact came through the scouting movement. Baden-Powell founded the Boy Scouts in 1908 based explicitly on the training methods and philosophy he developed during his military career, including the Mafeking siege. The emphasis on outdoor skills, resourcefulness, self-reliance, community service, and leadership through example, all scouting fundamentals derived directly from Baden-Powell's military experiences. The scouting movement grew to encompass tens of millions of members worldwide, making it one of the largest youth organizations in history. Its influence on 20th century childhood, particularly in English-speaking countries and former British colonies, was enormous. Millions of children learned camping, first aid, citizenship, and leadership through scouting programs directly descended from Mafeking's siege lessons. However, this legacy is deeply contested. The scouting movement's origins in imperial military culture, its early emphasis on racial hierarchies. African scouting was segregated and subordinated in many countries for decades. And Baden-Powell's own racist views all complicate the movement's historical assessment. Modern scouting organizations have largely transcended these origins, but the historical connections remain troubling for many. Sixth, regarding political impacts, the Boer War's outcome created the political conditions for apartheid. The compromise that ended the war, British military victory, followed by political accommodation of Afrikaner interests, gave white settlers control over South Africa's political system while excluding the African majority. This arrangement persisted for decades, evolving into the formal apartheid system after 1948. Mafeking's African population, having endured starvation during the siege, found themselves marginalized in the war's aftermath. Their suffering was forgotten in British celebrations of victory. The promises of better treatment, implicit in Baden-Powell's speeches during the siege, evaporated. The African stat was eventually relocated to inferior land outside town. This pattern of African sacrifice, followed by exclusion from victory's benefits, replicated across South Africa and became foundational to apartheid's logic. Seventh, culturally, Mafeking entered British popular consciousness as a symbol of pluck, resilience, and British character. The term Mafeking survived for decades, meaning to celebrate exuberantly. Baden-Powell became a folk hero whose image appeared on postcards, tobacco tins, and advertisements. Children played Relief of Mafeking games. The siege became part of Britain's self-mythology about imperial greatness. Yet this cultural memory was selective and sanitized. The African starvation deaths were minimized or ignored. The siege's moral complexities, choosing who would eat and who would starve, were simplified into narratives of heroism and villainy. The real decision's weight and horror were erased in favor of triumphalist storytelling. This selective memory served imperial propaganda but distorted historical understanding. The siege also influenced war propaganda techniques. Baden-Powell's use of newspapers, entertainment, and carefully crafted messages to maintain morale became a template for psychological operations in subsequent conflicts. During World War I, British and other military forces established sophisticated propaganda operations that built on Baden-Powell's insights about managing civilian and military morale during extended conflicts. Eighth, academically, Mafeking became a case study in military academies, business schools, and leadership programs. The siege exemplified adaptive leadership, resource management under scarcity, innovation under pressure, and maintaining morale during adversity. Countless books, articles, and courses have analyzed Baden-Powell's decisions, usually focusing on his tactical innovations while often glossing over the moral dimensions of his resource allocation choices. This academic attention ensured that Mafeking's lessons remained part of professional military education throughout the 20th century. Officers studying for command positions learned about fake minefields, aggressive defense, and psychological warfare by studying Baden-Powell's siege. Whether these lessons translated to better outcomes in subsequent wars is debatable. Many siege situations in later conflicts ended in disaster, despite commanders attempting to replicate Baden-Powell's methods. The key difference was often that Baden-Powell faced cautious besiegers who prioritized minimizing casualties, while later, besieged forces faced enemies willing to accept massive casualties to achieve victory. Finally, Mafeking influenced how siege warfare is conducted and understood in modern contexts. The siege demonstrated that with modern communications, African runners functioned as an irregular communication network. Besieged forces could maintain contact with outside command and coordinate relief efforts. This changed the calculus of siege warfare. Cutting communication lines became as important as cutting supply lines. Later sieges from Leningrad to Sarajevo would grapple with this reality. The humanitarian dimensions of siege warfare, specifically the problem of civilian populations trapped in combat zones, were highlighted by Mafeking's African population suffering. Though contemporary British audiences largely ignored this suffering, later international humanitarian law and war crimes definitions would identify deliberate civilian starvation as impermissible. The Geneva Convention's provisions on protecting civilians during siege operations developed partly in response to cases like Mafeking and much worse examples from World Wars I and II. In retrospect, Mafeking's historical significance derives not from any single element but from its convergence. A tactically innovative defense that succeeded against long odds, conducted in ways that revealed both human ingenuity and human cruelty, celebrated as heroic triumph while involving morally troubling choices and leaving legacies that ranged from the wholesome, scouting movement to the horrific, apartheid's political foundations. This complexity makes Mafeking simultaneously worthy of remembering and uncomfortable to remember fully. So why has Mafeking, once Britain's most celebrated military victory, inspiring riots of celebration across the empire, faded from popular memory while other battles remain famous? The reasons are multiple and reveal how historical memory is shaped by factors beyond events' actual importance. First, the complexity of context makes Mafeking difficult to teach and remember. Understanding why the siege mattered requires grasping late Victorian imperialism, the Transvaal gold rush's economic implications, Boer military culture, British strategic overextension, and the specific military technology of 1899–1900. This contextual density works against popular memory, which prefers simple narratives that can be summarized in a few sentences. Waterloo can be explained as Napoleon's final defeat, D-Day as the invasion that began liberating Europe. Mafeking requires a paragraph of backstory before the siege itself makes sense. Moreover, the siege involved no singular, dramatic moment. No charge of the Light Brigade, no Pickett's charge, no "we shall fight on the beaches" speech. Baden-Powell's genius lay in avoiding dramatic confrontations, instead grinding the Boers down through attrition, deception, and persistence. This approach succeeded militarily, but produced few iconic moments suitable for historical memory. The most dramatic events, the Boxing Day assault, the May raids, were significant, but not war-decisive. The siege's climax was relief arriving after months of slow starvation, which is powerful when experienced but anticlimactic when recounted. Second, Mafeking was not the final decisive moment of the Second Boer War. The siege ended in May 1900, but the war continued for 2 more years as Boers transitioned to guerrilla warfare. The truly decisive battles were elsewhere. Paardeberg, Bloemfontein, Pretoria's capture, and the subsequent counterinsurgency campaign. Mafeking was strategically important, but not war-winning. Historical memory tends to focus on decisive battles that clearly changed outcomes, ambiguous successes that contributed to eventual victory without determining it fade more easily. This is compounded by Britain's troubled relationship with the Boer War generally. Unlike World Wars I and II, which remained central to British national identity, the Boer War became increasingly uncomfortable to remember. The British invented concentration camps during this war, detention camps for Boer civilians that caused tens of thousands of deaths through disease and malnutrition. The scorched earth tactics and brutal counterinsurgency operations tarnished Britain's self-image as a civilized empire. Celebrating Mafeking requires engaging with the broader Boer War, which post-colonial Britain prefers to forget. Third, geographic and cultural distance have eroded Mafeking's resonance. The siege occurred in South Africa, making it inherently distant from European and American audiences. During the Victorian era, when British Empire was central to British identity, events in distant colonies mattered deeply to metropolitan populations. But as the empire dissolved after World War II and British identity became more European and less imperial, events in colonial wars lost their cultural relevance. Additionally, South Africa's subsequent history, particularly apartheid, made celebrating British imperial victories there morally uncomfortable. Mafeking's relief is historically connected, however indirectly, to the political arrangements that enabled apartheid. This connection makes celebrating the siege feel like celebrating a system of racial oppression, even though the direct connection is tenuous. Historical memory often simplifies these connections, and the simplest approach to uncomfortable history is forgetting it. Fourth, Mafeking has been overshadowed by later, larger sieges. The 20th century produced siege warfare on unprecedented scales. Leningrad, 872 days, approximately 1 million deaths. Stalingrad, 5 months, perhaps 2 million casualties. The siege of Sarajevo during Yugoslav wars, 1,425 days, and many others. Compared to these apocalyptic sieges, Mafeking, 217 days, perhaps 400 to 500 deaths, seems almost quaint. The scale of later sieges has retrospectively diminished Mafeking's apparent significance. Moreover, World War I's trench warfare created what were essentially massive mutual sieges lasting years and killing millions. The Western Front can be understood as a continent-spanning siege where both sides attempted to starve each other of resources, morale, and fighting capacity. Against this backdrop, a single-town siege seems tactically trivial, even if Mafeking pioneered some techniques that reappeared in trench warfare. Fifth, the political controversies around Baden-Powell and the African starvation deaths have complicated Mafeking's memory. Modern historians and activists have rightly highlighted the racist resource allocation and deliberate starvation of the African population. This scholarship makes celebrating the siege morally fraught. Any commemoration must grapple with the uncomfortable truth that British victory involved choosing which racial groups would eat and which would starve. Baden-Powell's later fame through scouting partially insulated him from criticism during his lifetime and for decades after. But as scouting's imperial and racial origins came under scholarly scrutiny from the 1980s onward, Baden-Powell's reputation became more contested. This controversy doesn't erase his tactical innovations, but does require historical accounts to present a more balanced, less hagiographic assessment. Such balanced accounts make poor material for popular celebration or simple historical memory. Sixth, the changing scales of warfare have made Mafeking's tactical innovations seem obsolete. Modern siege warfare involves missiles, drones, electronic warfare, and precision munitions, technologies that would make Baden-Powell's fake minefields and theatrical deceptions largely ineffective. While the psychological principles remain relevant, the specific tactics are historical curiosities rather than current military doctrine. Additionally, modern urban combat and asymmetric warfare have transformed how militaries think about defended positions. Contemporary military operations in cities like Fallujah, Mosul, or Mariupol involve combined arms operations coordinating air power, armor, infantry, and intelligence assets on scales unimaginable in 1899. Mafeking's relevance to modern military professionals has diminished as technology and doctrine evolved. Seventh, the narrative arc of British imperial history has marginalized colonial wars generally. Britain's popular historical consciousness focuses heavily on World Wars I and II, conflicts with clear moral frameworks, fighting fascism, enormous casualties, and existential stakes. The Victorian and Edwardian colonial wars, including the Boer War, occupy a more ambiguous moral space and receive correspondingly less attention in education, media, and popular culture. This marginalization is both cause and effect of forgetting Mafeking. As colonial wars faded from popular consciousness, their specific battles and sieges faded even faster. And as specific events like Mafeking were forgotten, the entire category of colonial warfare became easier to ignore or minimize. The result is that major events in our Victorian military history, which dominated newspaper headlines at the time, have become obscure to modern audiences. Despite these factors eroding popular memory, military historians have never forgotten Mafeking. Academic studies continue analyzing Baden-Powell's tactics, the siege's strategic consequences, and its moral dimensions. Military staff colleges still teach Mafeking as a case study in defensive operations, resource management, and psychological warfare. The siege remains historically significant, even if popularly obscure. Several biographies of Baden-Powell examine the siege extensively, usually as the defining event that enabled his later scouting career. Histories of the Second Boer War treat Mafeking as a major chapter. Scholarship on Victorian imperialism, military innovation, and siege warfare regularly references Mafeking. The academic record is robust and ongoing. Moreover, in South Africa itself, Mafeking, now officially called Mahikeng or Mafeking, remains part of local historical consciousness. The town maintains a museum dedicated to the siege. Annual commemorations occur, though increasingly focused on remembering all victims, including the African dead, rather than celebrating British victory. This local memory preserves details that international audiences have forgotten. The Scouting movement keeps Baden-Powell's memory alive globally, though increasingly focused on his youth education work rather than military career. Scout gatherings sometimes reference Mafeking as part of Baden-Powell's biography, though usually briefly and without engaging the siege's moral complexities. This selective memory serves organizational purposes, but contributes to Mafeking's popular obscurity. The most famous thing about Baden-Powell, founding the Scouts, has eclipsed his most famous military achievement. In literature and media, Mafeking has appeared occasionally but never achieved the cultural prominence of battles like Waterloo, Gettysburg, or D-Day. A few novels have featured the siege, usually as a background for adventure stories rather than serious historical examination. Films have largely ignored Mafeking, perhaps because its drama was psychological and incremental rather than visually spectacular. Television documentaries occasionally cover the siege as part of broader Boer War histories, but rarely dedicate entire episodes to it. The result is that Mafeking exists in a historical middle ground, too important to completely forget, too complicated and controversial to enthusiastically remember, significant enough to remain in academic consciousness, but obscure enough to have faded from popular awareness. This is arguably appropriate for an event that was genuinely tactically brilliant and strategically important, but also morally troubling and ultimately less decisive than it appeared at the time. In the end, Mafeking deserves to be remembered not because it was uncomplicated heroism. It wasn't, but because it reveals profound truths about human capability and human cruelty under extreme pressure, truths that remain relevant long after the specific tactical innovations became obsolete. Remember the date, October 13th, 1899, when Robert Baden-Powell made his binary choice: surrender and save lives immediately, or fight and gamble thousands of lives on the hope that relief would arrive before starvation forced collapse. That choice haunts any honest assessment of the siege because both options led to death, just different deaths at different times for different people. Remember the audacity, turning a death trap into a masterclass of defensive warfare through fake minefields, psychological operations, theatrical leadership, and aggressive raiding that transformed the mathematics of siege warfare. Baden-Powell demonstrated that human ingenuity and morale could multiply limited military power far beyond what arithmetic suggested possible. Remember the cost: 200–300 African civilians who starved to death in the Stadt while British forces maintained fighting rations. A brutal calculus of racial hierarchy determining who would eat and who would die. This cost reveals the darkest truth about siege warfare: that resource scarcity forces impossible moral choices, and that those choices inevitably follow existing power structures and prejudices. Remember the context: a world where European empires carved up continents, where a small republican government challenged the world's largest empire over gold and sovereignty, where modern weapons met Victorian tactics, and where the outcomes shaped Africa's political landscape for the next century. Mafeking mattered not because it was morally uncomplicated, but because its outcome influenced millions of lives far beyond the immediate participants. Remember that sometimes, at critical moments, individual actions matter enormously. That one commander's resourcefulness, courage, and ruthlessness prolonged a siege for 7 months, immobilized thousands of enemy fighters, and contributed to strategic outcomes far larger than his small garrison. This agency exists alongside the structural forces of economics, technology, and politics that ultimately determined the war's outcome, but it's not erased by those forces. Remember also that heroism and atrocity can coexist in the same event, that tactical brilliance doesn't erase moral culpability, and that celebrating victory requires acknowledging whose sacrifice purchased that victory and whether the celebration is honest about those costs. The tactical lessons from Mafeking: active defense over passive resistance, psychological warfare as a force multiplier, maintaining morale through leadership example and entertainment, using deception to compensate for material weakness, remain valid across contexts. Modern military forces still teach these principles because they reflect human psychology truths that transcend specific technologies or historical periods. But the moral lessons are equally important. The siege teaches that resource scarcity under pressure reveals priorities and prejudices, that leaders' decisions about who suffers determine who survives, and that moral compromises made under emergency conditions often replicate society's existing inequalities. Baden-Powell's choices weren't uniquely evil, they were typical of his era, class, and culture. But typical doesn't mean acceptable, and acknowledging historical context doesn't absolve moral responsibility. Mafeking also teaches humility about historical memory. What seemed world-shaking importance in 1900, celebrations across the empire, Baden-Powell as the most famous soldier alive, the siege dominating headlines for months, faded within decades to specialized historical knowledge. Events that shape their moment aren't guaranteed to echo through subsequent generations. The factors that preserve historical memory: narrative simplicity, moral clarity, connection to national identity, cultural continuity, often work against historically complex events receiving sustained attention. Yet the siege retains significance precisely because it resists simple categorization. It was both triumph and tragedy, both innovative defense and human rights catastrophe, both strategically important and morally compromised. This complexity makes Mafeking exemplary of Victorian imperialism generally, a system that generated extraordinary individual achievements and terrible collective crimes, often simultaneously, usually justified through racial theories that subsequent generations rightly condemned. The final paradox is that Mafeking's most lasting impact came through the Scouting movement, an organization dedicated to youth development, outdoor skills, community service, and international friendship, founded by a man whose most famous achievement involved defending a colonial railway town through methods that included racially stratified starvation. Baden-Powell transcended his imperial military origins to create something genuinely positive for millions of young people. Yet that positive legacy cannot erase the troubled origins. Perhaps this is the lesson: that history is complicated, that people are complicated, that events contain multitudes, and that honest memory requires holding contradictions rather than resolving them into simple narratives of heroism or villainy. October 13th, 1899 to May 17th, 1900. 217 days. One British colonel with theatrical flair and ruthless pragmatism. 1,400 soldiers and police facing 9,000 besiegers. 7,000 African civilians trapped between British rationing and Boer artillery. 400 to 500 dead by the end. Relief arriving just before collapse. A siege that became a legend, then became forgotten, yet continues to teach for anyone willing to learn its complicated lessons. This is our history: British history, South African history, military history, human history, and its worth, remembering accurately, completely, uncomfortably, and honestly. Not to celebrate uncritically or condemn absolutely, but to understand how people facing impossible choices make decisions that ripple through time, creating consequences that outlast memory. The story of Mafeking is ultimately the story of how humans behave under pressure, how leaders choose between terrible options, how courage and cruelty coexist, how tactical brilliance doesn't guarantee moral righteousness, and how historical memory simplifies complexity while time erodes even the most dramatic events. Remember Mafeking, not as sanitized heroism, but as complicated human reality, not as forgotten obscurity, but as obscured significance, not as simple past, but as continuing conversation about leadership, sacrifice, justice, survival, and the costs we accept to achieve the outcomes we desire. The walls are gone. The trenches are filled. The buildings are rebuilt. The survivors are all dead, but the questions remain. What price victory? Whose suffering purchased survival? Which memories do we preserve? Which do we forget? And what does that selectivity reveal about our values? These questions echo beyond Mafeking, beyond the Boer War, beyond Victorian imperialism, into every human conflict where scarcity forces allocation choices and power determines who pays the costs. This is worth remembering. This is our history, and it matters still.